Well, child protection actors have a big role to play in advocating for mine action awareness and response. I would definitely suggest that the first thing that child protection actors in the field do is assess the status of the country or the territory that they're in. There's an online resource called Landmine Monitor that has a lot, it does country profiles, so you can find out whether the country you're in is the state party to the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Treaty. You can find out what the extent of the contamination is, what kind of activities are going on. And with that information, you can then advocate to the government that you're working with on their international obligations, whether they're already a state party and they need to fulfill those obligations, or rather just from the normative effect of all the other state parties. I'd also recommend considering whether the donors are state parties, because that's also really important to integrate into any of your proposals, that you can show your donors that you're actually helping them fulfill their obligations, because part of their obligations is supporting clearance in other affected states. So there's advocacy in both of those areas. The other thing is that, bearing in mind that child protection is a very practical aspect of protection, and you're going to be involved in humanitarian response and planning, is just to make sure that mine action is not an afterthought. So when you're in the early phases of planning a humanitarian response, don't forget to ensure mine action is integrated, because otherwise then you try to go in and respond, and then the explosive hazards can kill the humanitarian workers, it can block your access. So really just being aware, starting with this webinar and then applying it to the situation you're in is incredibly valuable. There are three main ones that deal with indiscriminate weapons. The first one, and probably the most well-known one, is the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Treaty, and that has been an astonishingly successful instrument of international humanitarian law. More than 80% of member states have signed up to it, and millions of landmines, stockpiled landmines, have been destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of contaminated areas have been cleared, and the most successful part, perhaps, in my opinion, is the fact that it has really established a normative basis against the use of landmines. So even the member states who haven't necessarily signed the treaty generally do not use landmines. So we've seen a massive reduction in the use of landmines. We've seen incredible drops in casualties globally from anti-personnel landmines. So that's been incredibly successful. There are two other main ones. One is the Convention Against the Use of Certain Conventional Weapons, which is the trickiest to say because it's a bit of a tongue twister. And there are two particular protocols in that convention that are specific to mine action. The first one is amended Protocol 2, and that deals with mines and booby traps and other explosive devices with indiscriminate effects. The second one is amended Protocol 5, which deals with explosive remnants of war. And that's one that is increasingly important because as we see the casualties from anti-personnel landmines dropping, we are seeing continuing increase in casualties from explosive remnants of war, and children are particularly at risk from explosive remnants of war. The third main one is the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Again, this is one that is very relevant to children, as children tend to be very at risk from cluster munitions as well. And that has over 100 member states that have signed up now. It's not as old as the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Treaty, but again, there has been a lot of progress in diminishing the use and then in turn the casualties. Definitely, in terms of advocating, we can advocate for all of the treaties that we've already discussed with parties to the conflict. So obviously that's member states, but increasingly that means non-state actors as well. And there's an organization called Geneva Call that specifically specializes in promoting international humanitarian law, including those mine action related instruments, to non-state actors. So I'd really recommend looking them up. The other thing, in terms of how we kind of promote how important mine action can be in peace building and peace sustainment, is when a country is looking at a ceasefire agreement or ultimately a peace agreement, is to really promote the inclusion of mine action in that process. So, a recent example of where this has been successful is in Colombia. And that was basically the mine action actors and the protection cluster and protection sector really highlighting what a problem that contamination was going to cause when there were flows of displaced people that start returning to their former villages and communities and being killed, being injured. This is not going to build confidence in the peace process. And so actually the peace process that is now being agreed, there is a specific mine action section where some of the clearance of landmines and explosive hazards will actually they will also be training demobilized soldiers who will carry this out as part of their reparations to their community. So it forms a really substantive part of the peace agreement. So that's something really important to promote as well.